Margaret, thank you for taking the time with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
When I go through your resume, I feel like before you were a panda hugger. Can I call you that?
Yeah, I have a picture of myself hugging a panda. I do indeed, yes.
Yeah. So
in Chengdu.
You first visit China in 1979. That was the China just opening up. And you spent decades building scientific cooperation between the two countries. You were even a vice president of the Canada-China Friendship Society and spent several years on Canada-China Joint Committee on Science and Technology. You even edited the English translation of China's National Innovation Index. What changed your mind from being a panda hugger to one of the most prominent China skeptics in Canada?
Well, in fact, you're right. I was there in 79. I went at that time because I wanted to see the Xinjiang Democracy Wall. So my real interest, and it was really compelling for me, was to go and talk to the students and workers who were putting up big character posters at that time calling for a fifth modernization, democracy. And so I did that. I was part of the University of Toronto group that was also visiting universities around the country to see how they were coming out of the Cultural Revolution. And it motivated me to do a master's focused on China. But my career in government for 37 years was primarily in science and technology, policy and programs and funding, 13 years at the assistant deputy minister level. And so I decided when I retired that I would become an academic in the sense of writing and researching about China's innovation system for a Canadian audience. We haven't had anybody focused on those issues in Canada. And so I thought that was something where I could really add value because you're right that I was very involved in the Science and Technology Joint Commission and worked up with many collaborators, Chinese Academy of Sciences, CASTED, even the State Council Office, worked on collaborations on science and technology with China. And as I was working on researching this after I retired, I started to see real problems that were going to be issues for Canada. These were emerging problems. They started really with the arrival of Xi Jinping as the president. And starting in about 2014, I was seeing things like his renewed focus on the integration of civilian and military technology development. I was seeing serious problems with the technology joint ventures that Canada had with China and other countries as well. And I worked on even a science and technology history of Canada-China relations in that area, and incubators and accelerators for startup companies. But I was seeing problems like the risk that if Canadian researchers, many of whom I had encouraged to partner with China, were partnering with civilian researchers, they wouldn't be aware that their innovations were going out the back door to the PLA. And so I became concerned about that. And we talk about dual use, civilian uses, military uses, as if there's an innovation sitting on a shelf somewhere and you could use it for one thing or the other. But what China does is that its military researchers partner with civilian researchers in such a way that it redirects the research into military applications. So a research could be focused on civilian application, but gets redirected and then enriched with the military applications, even something like basic research, which is about the chemistry of products and chemistry of things and really fundamental research can have important applications for the military and advanced materials and so on. So as I was seeing these problems, I was doing a lot of briefings of Canadian government officials, and they were very receptive. These were all people I knew with my previous government hat on. And so, people at what was then called Industry Canada, it's now ISED, Global Affairs Canada, National Research Council, Privy Council Office, security people, and others like that, Department of National Defense, CSIS, and CSEC. So I was doing a whole range of briefings on those issues. And in December 2018, I went to China to speak at an international conference, but also to brief people in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, as well as the consulate in Shanghai, about the problems with the joint ventures and China's emerging role in the Arctic and what its plans were. And you can see a lot in the science, technology, and innovation plans of China, where they want to go with the research. And for example, doing a 5-year study from 2015 to 2020 on the security of the Arctic. Why is China studying the security of the Arctic? Also doing mapping of the Northwest Passage. Why are they mapping Canada's inland waterway? And so I was raising big red flags, so to speak, about those issues. But the Michaels were taken when I was in Shanghai. And I mentioned it to a Chinese executive with whom I was meeting. And he said, oh yes, Beijing has a list of 100 Canadians they can pick up and detain at any time. When I got back to Canada, I heard from 2 other people about this list. And when I was in Shanghai and returned back to my hotel room, my locked suitcases had been searched. Nothing was taken, but they had been searched. And so I decided when I got back that it was people like me who, as you say, I was vice president of the Canada-China Friendship Society, people like me who were at the embassy all the time at different functions and meetings and so on, we were the ones who needed to speak out about hostage taking of innocent Canadians. And so I started, I gave my first ever interview. I had never been interviewed before. I always shied away from it because I was afraid of, making a mistake or whatever. But I thought, I've got to do these interviews. Then I was invited to write some opinion pieces. I was always the ADM that was saying, I will never write op-eds in the Globe and Mail telling the government what it should do. When I'm retired, what a silly thing to do. Now I've written many dozens of op-eds, but the injustice. I've got a very strong sense of ethics and injustice, and the injustice of kidnapping innocent Canadians was something I had to speak up about. And we had a case prior to the Michaels, Kevin and Julia Garrett, who were a Christian couple who ran a restaurant in Dandong opposite North Korea, and they were taken hostage too and charged, as the Michaels were, because the US wanted to extradite a Chinese Canadian from BC to the US. They accused him of stealing aerospace secrets. Ultimately, he decided to go there himself, serve his time, and then come back to Canada. So that's what prompted me to speak out. And I think a lot of Canadians found it was a wake-up call about China, that they would take innocent Canadians. There were many people who were concerned, but not as many people who were speaking out, and so I just decided that I needed to do that.
It's really sad to see people tend to forget what's happened just a few years ago. and they started already hug China again.
Yes, that's a good point. We did the same thing after Tiananmen. For about a year, the Canadian government were really hands-off of Canada-China relations. It was a big shock, and the immediate thing the government did after that was it said that any Chinese student or Chinese person who had been in Canada and wanted to stay could stay, no questions asked. And there was a professor of economics who had been writing that you can't have economic reform without political reform. Right. And he came and lived with my husband and me for a year and a half. Individual Canadians were doing what they could. I was a director general at the time, but I attended one of the student protests on Parliament Hill. There were protests there, and there were also protests outside the Chinese embassy in support of the students. And I thought that their cause was really just.
Tiananmen massacre is kind of like earliest wake-up call.
Yes.
For many people.
The Xinjiang Democracy Wall was 10 years before that, and Wei Jingsheng and several others who were instigators of that were put in prison too. So the Chinese government does this from time to time. They leave the door wide open, they encourage open thought, and then they crack down. And after Tiananmen, about a year after, the business community in Canada started putting pressure on our Prime Minister, who was Brian Mulroney, to revisit the relationship, and they started sending business groups over again. Yeah. So they get over it, I guess.
When I was reading Chinese history, I found out that this kind of strategy or pattern had been repeated so many times, even before the establishment of PRC. It's during the Mao's revolutionary time, he did it within the party.
Oh, within the party, yes, exactly right, yes.
And welcome people to criticize them and lock them up.
Yes.
And they did it again during the
1958.
China is not only authoritarian at home, but now with their economic power and military power, they started to reach out to the world. And for example, there is overseas police stations, election interference, the harassment of Canadian citizens of Chinese descent, and also Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and many of them are well documented by CSIS and RCMP and Canadian or American government. When you connect those dots, what is the Chinese state actually trying to achieve inside the Western world?
They're trying to do two things primarily. One is quiet dissent abroad. So they don't want, as you say, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers revealing what China is doing domestically. And so they denied what was happening with the Uyghurs, all of the internment camps that look like prisons that were being built, and that there was proof. I mean, there was infrastructure there to do it. They denied, and then ultimately said, oh, well, it was re-education, and then said they were all released. Well, they weren't released. Many were sent to prisons, others, hundreds of thousands sent to forced labor. This is like the slavery, forced labor in the US South in the 1700s. That's what it's like. It's not just, severe working conditions. It's real slavery. And I don't call it modern slavery as some people do, because it's there's nothing modern or streamlined or positive about it. It's raw slavery. They don't want people to learn about that. They also don't want the Uyghurs and Hong Kongers abroad to influence government officials and government ministers in other countries. And so Michael Chong, when he was supportive of calling it a Uyghur genocide, and there was a vote in parliament, he was sanctioned. It was a unanimous vote that yes, it's a Uyghur genocide. Subsequently, the leader of the Uyghurs in Canada, Mehmet Toti, who's executive director of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, I'm proud to be on the advisory board of that, he had helped Samir Zuberi, who's a Liberal member of Parliament, to have a vote in Parliament to bring 10,000 Uyghurs to Canada. And a few weeks before the vote, which was a scheduled vote, Mehmet received a call from the Ministry of Public Security saying that he knew that his brothers had been killed in the camps already. They told him his mother and his sisters had been killed in the camps, and they were now holding his cousin. I guess they had run out of immediate family. And they were holding his cousin, and he must stop the vote in the House of Commons. This is a vote that he had helped to organize. Mehmet didn't say anything to anybody about that phone call until the press conference right after the vote, which was again a unanimous vote. All of the members of cabinet, including the prime minister, voted to bring 10,000 Uyghurs to Canada. And Mehmet told this story at the press conference right after the vote. That's the lengths that they go to silence diaspora. And we see that in other ways. The point of the police stations is that there are offices that they can go to and kind of set up shop and then go out and harass community members to get them to be silent about things they had been writing online by threatening their family members back in China. What they've done in some cases, we've seen recently, several people were found guilty for the New York City police station. There are more than 100 of these worldwide, and it's Safeguard Defenders who have made these locations public and gotten the attention of Western governments. In New York City, a tactic that was used was the Ministry of Public Security had an MOU with the New York Police Department, NYPD, and they would go door to door threatening people. The police brought over under this so-called police station, and they would show the MOU with the NYPD to say, we're working closely with the NYPD. They too say that you have to return to China, or they too say that you have to be silent, or something's going to happen to your relative back in China. It's a tactic they used when the Toronto police, in response to the police stations in Canada, said that they were going to just post a Toronto police car outside the locations where these police stations were located. I said, don't do that, because people will point out the window and say, see, we're working with the Toronto police. They're on our side. They're supportive of us and what we're doing. So these are tactics that they use. So that's to silence dissent. Another tactic they use to silence dissent is what I call intimidation by vehicle. And this has happened to me. I have a little sports car, and it used to have a license plate, Haoche, CHE, nice car. But I was followed on a highway at 110 kilometers with the other car so close behind me that I couldn't read the license plate. And I would slow right down, and she would slow down, and I would speed up and she would speed up. Finally, I got in behind a transport truck and pulled out and saw there was nobody on the highway ahead. It was a straight line highway, and so I just gunned it up to 175 and got away from her. The truck driver must have been surprised. This happened to another person I know who also works with the Uyghurs, actually with several others. And there have been car accidents. And I once was co-chairing with Global Affairs Canada a meeting of human rights defenders related to China. And I asked the group of them, how many of you have had this kind of experience of being intimidated by another car? And 7 of them put up their hands. So this is another tactic. So they're trying to silence dissent, and then they're also trying to ingratiate themselves with the Chinese-Canadian diaspora. This diaspora is very multifaceted. There are some people who are recently arrived from China and are very pro-China and want to increase trade and rah-rah, and they think the people at the embassy are fantastic. And there are others who left China to get away from the oppression of the regime, or left Hong Kong for that reason. They create lots of soft power, like small think tanks that are funded completely by the consulates, that fund research into pro-China things. There are many committees that are pro what they call reunification with Taiwan, which is not really reunification because they haven't been, CCP and Taiwan have never been together. In fact, I noticed several in Toronto, and I remarked at that in a group that of friends that I have who are mostly Chinese Canadians. And I said, well, that's interesting that there's some in Toronto, but there aren't any here in Ottawa. And one of them said, are you kidding? There are 3 of them. And they recently had a meeting with the Toronto ones and the ones in from Montreal at the embassy with the ambassador. And I went online, and sure enough, here are photos of this big meeting. So, it's these are committees where it will mobilize at a point where China decides to move on Taiwan, that they would mobilize these people to put pressure on Canadian politicians. And so it's this kind of soft friendship kind of committees and other organizations throughout Canadian society.
I remember they did a rally in Ottawa for opposing the Foreign Registry Act, hundreds of them.
Yes.
In Ottawa.
Those were organized by Senator O and Senator Wu, who are both very big supporters of China. And they rallied a lot of funding from, I'm sure, the embassy and the consulates, and bussed a lot of people to Ottawa for those rallies. They weren't successful. The registry is to be created. There has been someone identified to run it. It still isn't running at this moment, but it's imminent. And so they tried their best to fight that, and have not been successful.
I know that the U.S. have the same law already, and they already arrested several Chinese figures, including the one you just told me in New York, who set up the police station. They are charged. But now no one is charged in Canada. And even with the passing of this law, and it's not implemented yet.
It's not implemented, and worse than that, when it is implemented, it's going to be focused on electoral interference. And rather than the broader interference when people are going door to door harassing Chinese Canadians. That's what we really need, and that's what the American one does. The Canadians looked at the whole range of models and have decided apparently that it's going to be narrowly focused. So that's a disappointment.
This really brings me to another question. It has to be a strong economic incentives to co-op with China to stop these anti-communist campaigns or efforts. But in reality, Canada doesn't really need anything from China. You've pointed out that China takes only about 3.8% of Canada's exports, against more than 76% for the United States. Why we really need China? Why we really fear China? We have to sacrifice one thing for another one. Why do I have to do that?
Well, I think the early part of your question is a good one, because in fact, China cannot help Canada solve its trade problem. The reason is our biggest trade problem right now is autos, where we've now got this big new American tariff, and steel and aluminum, where we have big American tariffs. China doesn't want to help us with those problems. In fact, China wants to make those problems worse by selling their EVs to us to further undermine our auto sector, and by selling cheaper steel and aluminum, and in fact implicate us in forced labor, because the cars and the aluminum have forced labor in them from the Uyghur region. You know, it implicates Western countries when we accept these. Right now we've got, apparently ships coming with the EVs as we speak. The steel and aluminum have continuing tariffs, but also remissions. There's a section of the budget that allows for remissions so that the Chinese companies can get the money back for the taxes, the tariffs that they have been put on. China doesn't want our aluminum or our cars or our steel. They want our resources. And going into the discussions in Beijing in January, I was saying that we should not agree to bringing EVs. They've got a lot of problems. And what we should do instead is offer some increased ownership of or investment in conventional energy, not clean energy, because China's done a lot of joint ventures in clean energy and have completely taken Canadian little small and medium-sized enterprises to the cleaners. And so we don't want that. So I was distressed to hear that we were going to have more joint ventures, and started speaking out publicly against that. And to their credit, Minister Joly's office reached out to me and had me do 3 different briefings for them on the pitfalls of joint ventures. And so they now know what the risks are. And I think they need to be a lot more careful than Canadian companies have been in the past. The response of the Chinese ambassador to that is that she has no right to put any conditions on joint ventures. That should just be up to the 2 companies in the joint venture. And so we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. It's good to hear that our government is still want advice from people like you.
Well, I've recently also briefed senior officials at I said is the acronym. It's Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, especially the auto group, because there are a lot of problems with autos as they're being Chinese cars being sold in Europe, and factories that have been set up in Brazil and Hungary with forced labor. And so I've been briefing them on all of that. Mm. Just about a month ago, China brought in a new policy saying that the entire supply chain of all of their products, all products, is now under the umbrella of national security. And nobody can ask for any details of anything in the supply chain. So up until now, even those Western companies, like the Western auto companies, Toyota, Volkswagen, GM, Ford that have joint ventures in China, they would ask about where is such and such coming from, and their partner, their joint venture partner, Chang'an or whatever it was, would say, that's not your business, that's operational. And it's true. The Chinese partner in China, in those joint ventures, always have the operational control. They appoint the legal person who controls the chop, which means they control the company. And so really, the Western company has no role except to provide open access to its own technology. So all these Chinese EV companies are built on Western technology, and then they've put some bells and whistles on it. But now, if you asked about the aluminum in the EVs, which Human Rights Watch has shown in a report called Asleep at the Wheel, if you ask today, where exactly is this aluminum in this particular vehicle from, you would get an answer, we can't tell you because it's now national security. That's a problem for Canadians. Canadians need to know if slave labor is making the EV that they're buying. Nobody wants to think that their car is made from the blood of people who are working for no money.
Now, one thing is ideological and value. The other one is economic, because they intentionally lower the labor cost.
Yes, that's right, exactly right. Yeah. And they are using now electricity produced in Xinjiang with forced labor and sending that electricity across the whole country. So almost any product could be made in a factory that's using electricity made with forced labor.
I think that tells you that the Chinese economy is in trouble because they don't have enough young people to work in factories, and they have to use forced laborers like Uyghurs to do those jobs to keep the labor costs low in order to compete in the international market.
Well, I think they're using it, yes, they're using it as punishment for the Uyghurs, to take them out of a regular workforce, to take them out of living in their communities. Yeah. Very often these places where, material is processed is, 40 or 50 miles from a city. It's destroying the workforce and the people of Xinjiang, the communities. And in the meantime, the children are in their own little re-education camps where they don't go home. So that is to lower the prices. But at the same time, there's a high unemployment rate of young people in China. And that's concerning. And there's increased robotics. So what are those young people thinking they're going to do with these robotics factories and AI taking all the new roles and the exciting roles? So this is a big management problem for the regime. The regime needs stability. The last thing in the world they want is for the young people to rise up, as they started to do with the paper protests, the white paper protests. They started to respond to that, and so there was a clampdown of the white paper protests, even something as innocent as that. A new development just this week is that they've started exit bans on anybody who's senior on AI. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Chinese on AI, there's an exit ban. They can't even travel to conferences. They're not allowed to go abroad. I guess they feel that they might leave and not come back. And that would be a risk because they want to keep all those people. The demographics for China going forward are really bad. And they aren't helping themselves with measures like this. They're not accepting immigrants still. And so, you can't see except that increasingly robotic factories, which is what they're building abroad. Premier Ford in Canada has talked about, well, as long as they build factories here, we won't have a problem with that. Good union jobs, high-paying union jobs. That's not the kind of factory they build. They build almost completely roboticized, and the few people they do hire are low-wage labor. And the people that build the factories are brought in from China. And it's really an assembly plant with a kit, what's called a knockdown kit. And Minister Jolie, to her great credit, when Stellantis announced that they were going to have an assembly plant with these kits, said, no, you're not. And we want full factories using Canadian aluminum and steel and union jobs. And now the companies are backing off. That's not their model at all. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen now that China can't help Canada with that automotive job problem that we've got. And yet we have this strategic partnership. And the Prime Minister, in my view, should not have agreed to bring the EVs in. I think he thought that he had to. But Canadians are well known in China to be poor negotiators. And they call us very Han, which is first tone, not Han, fourth tone. So not Han Chinese. Call us Han, which is straightforward and outgoing. And they laugh behind our backs because the other meaning of the word Han is foolish and naive. And we're foolish and naive in our negotiations. They should have had a much shorter list of things that they were willing to give, and EVs should not have been on that list. The Prime Minister thought he could contain it to a small number of cars, 49,000 rising to 70,000. 70,000 is more than half of all EVs sold in Canada last year. The PM talks about it as only 3% of cars sold in Canada, but it's more than 50% of those sold in Canada last year. So it's a big number, and it's going to displace not just EV sales, other EV companies, but it's going to displace combustion and even used car sales. So I don't think the Canadian automotive sector is ready for this. A lot of people, including union people and the manufacturers themselves, are upset about it. And so I don't think we should have gone that way. The Prime Minister and ministers like to say that they are eyes wide open about China, and they're very clear-eyed about China, but they're not really as clear-eyed as they should be. And in fact, their eyes have dollar signs in them when they think about increased trade. And that's reinforced by the business community pushing for more trade. They're blind, their eyes are blind to the human rights infringements in China and the growing infringements there. The reason I started doing more work on human rights and the Uyghurs is from the angle of surveillance technologies and the vast array of surveillance technologies they have. Many people have heard about prisoners are made to sit in when they're detained, where your wrists are clamped with iron clamps and your ankles are clamped, and you have to sit there for 7 or 8 hours a day as interrogators scream at you. The ones used in Xinjiang have a neck brace as well, a metal neck brace that holds your head up. People need to know about these kinds of things. This is what got me into the more human rights, although as we said at the outset, I first went to China because I was motivated to hear more about the democracy wall, the Xinjiang democracy wall. So it's a disappointment that our government is opening the door now to more business with China, but I think they're going to be surprised that it's not as clear a road as they had anticipated.
At the end of the day, the Chinese government is not willing to do business with outside. It's just trying to take advantage of the business and then learn the know-how and steal the technology, make it cheaper and kick you out.
Exactly. And you see it in every single sector. They've done it in clean energy. They've taken so many little Canadian companies and just taken away all their technology. There was even a Canadian military technology where the company went over there. Why on earth they would go over and try to sell things to the PLA, I don't know. But they had a joint venture, and the guy told me, the CEO told me that the Chinese partner was to go out and get sales and do distribution. The first few years they didn't do anything. And the factory, the guy brought all his factory equipment over, and it was all set up and they were making stuff, but the Chinese partner wasn't doing anything. And finally he got fed up and just left it all there and came back to Canada. Now they've got it all. And, part of the joint venture is technology transfer to the Chinese partner. So it disturbs me when that happens with the military technology.
I feel like from the communist angle, that all you guys are capitalists. All you guys are enemies. I talk with you, like we work with you, it's just a way to defeat you. But right now we have to lay low, we have to learn from the West, that's the way of thinking.
Right, and people like Orville Schell and Elizabeth Economy and I loved the idea of communes and peasants and everybody working for the common good. But that's not what China is today. It's a surveillance state. And actually, about 4 years ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Ottawa Citizen about the surveillance technologies that were being used. And in the op-ed, I used the word totalitarian, and saying it was moving towards a totalitarian state. And I was expecting that the editor was going to take that word out. And instead, they said, China is totalitarian as the headline of the op-ed. Because really, if you look at it, except for North Korea, there aren't many countries that are as totalitarian as China is. Yep. I mean, I became a good friend of someone in the State Council office, and he had always been free to speak positively about what was going on in China, but also critically about things that China wasn't getting right. And he would go abroad often and would hear what Western countries were doing. This is how I met him, and would go back and talk about what China should be doing. One day, he said something that was critical of one of Xi Jinping's policies, and he was detained and interrogated. And then he lost his job. And then he decided he was leaving. So he's now left. Mm-hmm. Fortunately for him, his son was already out, and he's gone and staying in the West. Mm-hmm. So, this is what's happening. They're losing some of their best people. And it's their fault. It's the fault of the regime. But the regime will end up with yes men around Xi Jinping who probably won't warn him when he's doing things that are really dangerous for the country, because they don't want to be sidelined. And, that's never a good thing for a leader, to have just yes men around him.
I joke that people in the West wants to buy cheaper stuff. That's understandable. And but you have to remember that the cost seems lower, but it's gonna cost your husband's job. You buy cheaper stuff from China, then the factory in your country will be closed.
Yeah, and that's what
result.
we're seeing in big cities in the U.S. Is whole sectors being impoverished because of cheap products coming in from China, and now China is learning that it can set up branch plants in Vietnam, and for those people who won't buy from China, they might buy from Vietnam or Cambodia. It's the same products.
The final part is about Taiwan.
For the last 8 or 9 years, I've been writing about Taiwan. I've been very concerned about the trends of China and this so-called reunification. I saw this back in 2014 when Xi Jinping was telling Chinese to get into senior positions in international organizations. So scientists get into the senior positions in scientific organizations, engineers the same thing, business people the same thing, international organizations of all kinds. And so I've written about that. And it comes down, it's not just the big ones like WHO that we're familiar with, but it's also qualitatively important organizations. So about 3 years ago, BirdLife International, which is the international organization for people who are bird watchers and follow birds and are studying birds, kicked Taiwan out at China's insistence. And so now the Taiwanese they're not allowed to attend those meetings, but the downside for the organization and for all the other members of the organization is they're missing Taiwan birds. Taiwan has some of those most beautiful birds in the world. I follow Taiwan birds on X, and everybody should. They're absolutely gorgeous birds. And, the rest of the world is missing that. And Taiwan has so much to give. We saw that during the COVID pandemic, where the people of Taiwan were protected. They had policies that other countries should have used to protect their own citizens. They're literally right next door to China. And yet, despite what was the massive deaths in China, we'll never know how many, because there are many more than they've admitted to, Taiwan was virtually protected by their policies and their PPE, the quality of their PPE and their medical profession. There's so much the world can learn from Taiwan. And so it's disturbing to see them, bit by bit, and, China plays the long game, as we've seen, excluded from organizations, including the International Aviation Organization. That's a safety problem. Apparently, a very large portion of the world's air flights go through Taipei, and especially freight and so on. Taipei and Taiwan need to be plugged into ICAO, but they're not because of China's pressure. And China moved to be the Secretary General of ICAO and the heads of the Secretariat of ICAO, and so this is their tactic. And in international organizations, it seems to be working for them. They are now more aggressively using levers against the West to try to change the West's behavior on Taiwan. And it's been chilling for me as a Canadian to see this applied against Canada. When the Prime Minister came back from China, I was saying in interviews that I was concerned that what China learned from that visit was that using canola as pressure works, because they wanted to send EVs to Canada, and they used canola as leverage. And so because Canada caved, what China learned from that visit is that using canola works as leverage. Canada caved. We're very Han in our negotiations. We're naive. And they thought that they had to accept the EVs, so they did. So now China has learned, use canola as leverage. And I've said to several parliamentary committees now that Canada's number one China policy should be to diversify canola away from China. Because as long as they can use that as leverage and it works, then our policies are not independent. Our policies are made in Beijing. And my biggest concern was that they would use that regarding Taiwan. And so after the Prime Minister returned from China, the Chinese ambassador did an interview with the Globe and Mail. And in that interview, he said that Beijing would now, from now on, not accept that any members of parliament ever again go to Taiwan. And that's something that Canadian MPs, especially those on the Canada-Taiwan Friendship Committee, do all the time, is back and forth visits with Taiwan. And to his credit, Michael Chung, the foreign affairs critic for the Conservative Party, the first thing he did was he bought a ticket to Taipei and went over and had a series of meetings with top ministers and with the president. And good for him. That was exactly the thing to do. What we'll be watching for is Liberal MP Judy Scrow, and whether she can travel to Taiwan or whether the Prime Minister's office says that she can't and other Liberal MPs can't. So that's something that we'll be watching. The other thing that they did was they said that the ambassador, Chinese ambassador, said that Canadian ships should no longer go through the Taiwan Strait. Well, when you're down in Vietnam or the neighboring countries there, and you want to go to South Korea or Japan, the straight line is up through the Strait of Taiwan. And by coincidence, 4 days ago, the HMCS Charlottetown, a big Canadian ship, finished its exercises in the Philippines and then went to Vietnam, and 4 days ago left Vietnam. I'm waiting to see if it goes through the Taiwan Strait. We normally do that, and the reason we do is to demonstrate that it's international waters. Just like the Northwest Passage is Canadian, and China wants it to be international waters, Canada sees the Taiwan Strait as international waters. And so this is going to be an important measure. If Canada goes straight through, good for them, despite what the Chinese ambassador threatened. A third thing is Taiwan Investment Agreement, which has been ready now for a year and a half to be signed. And Prime Minister Carney has not signed it. And we have not gotten a clear answer to date on why. But when a Le Devoir journalist visited Taiwan a few weeks ago, she was told, no, it won't be signed. She wasn't given a reason. That's disgraceful. We have so much to benefit from in a Taiwan investment agreement, including a lot of Taiwan investment money in Canada, but also more direct access to Taiwan chips, which of course everybody wants. If we had a Taiwan investment agreement, we would get readier access, I'm sure, to those chips. So we are cutting our arms off and our legs, and that's regrettable, I think.
When we're talking about technology transfer, I think it's also related to the safety and security of Taiwan Strait and the Indo-Pacific, because when we transfer the technology to China, so China can use that to build up their military and ultimately threatening the safety of the region. In the West, we are helping China to invade Taiwan in the future.
Well, in fact, this is a good news story on the part of Canada. And by that I mean, when I was doing all of these briefings of the government from 2014 through the pandemic, and more recently, I was talking about the risks of the integration of military and civilian technology development and what the risks to Canada would be. And slowly the Canadian government started to put in place measures. The first measure was in 2020, and I should give credit to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, for their work on the military presence of military scientists and engineers in Canadian, American, UK, and other universities. They did groundbreaking work on that back in 2019. And I used that a lot, constantly. It was always in my presentations. And that's one of the reasons that we put in place first brochures for professors of what to watch for in their collaborations with China, really detailed, really user-friendly brochures. Then there was a whole screening mechanism through NSERC. NSERC is the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council in Canada. My last job before I retired was Executive Vice President of that. And they put in place with CSIS and with ISED a whole series of mechanisms to review sensitive technologies and was there a risk. In the first year, 2/3 of the projects were turned back because yes, there were risks. And no, you shouldn't do those projects. So lucky that they put that in place. Then, and here's more kudos to different people, Bob Fife and Steve Chase did a big expose on one military university and its tentacles out across Canadian universities. More than 50 Canadian universities had research collaborations with this one military university. I think it was the National Defense University of China. And very quickly, the Minister Champagne, Francois-Philippe Champagne, who had dealt with the problems with the Michaels, who had dealt with the problems of Huawei, who had dealt with the problems of gold mines that China was trying to get its hands on in Canada, he put in place a list of about 100 universities and institutes in China that Canadians must not collaborate on technology with. So that was a third level. All of that now makes Canada the gold standard for research integrity and research security, for not partnering. So it wasn't just military universities in China, but it was mostly in China, but also a few in Russia and Iran. And so the government can say, well, we weren't picking on China. Well, actually, they were targeting China primarily, but they put in some other universities as well. So I'm really proud of that. I had a very small role in that and helping the journalists with some of their stories and so on. And I'm proud of that because I think Canada is now the gold standard for research security. One other thing I would like to mention about Taiwan is that A fourth area where the ambassador has said that we must change our policy is he wants Canada to support China for membership in the CPTPP. China and Taiwan applied at about the same time, like within 24 hours of each other. Mm-hmm. There's no question at all that Taiwan should be a member of CPTPP. It can meet every single one of the requirements, mm-hmm. Which there are a lot of requirements. China can't. It doesn't use rule of law. It's proven at the WTO that it just ignores the rules that it doesn't mm-hmm. want to follow. And so it can't, but it's going to be using its economic leverage, taking us back to canola, mm-hmm. that Canada has to support China. Probably they've told Global Affairs Canada, China, and not Taiwan. We can just assume that was the instruction. And so again, Taiwan is victimized if we follow through on that. So these are things that we'll be watching closely in the Canadian government's suite of policies moving forward. And these will be critically important indicators. Taiwan essentially is the canary in the coal mine for Canadian foreign policy being independent. Because if we cave in on those four things, then essentially Canadian foreign policy is made in Beijing. And that's not a good thing for any Canadian.
I think that's pretty much, that's it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for your time.